In the spring of 2026, 4 watches from one small workshop each crossed $1 million in a single night in New York. Not Rolex, not Patek. A tiny independent maker most people at the counter have never heard of. That is the market we are standing in right now. So when somebody walks in and asks what everyone wants, the honest answer is not the one you would expect. These are the 7 vintage pieces people ask for the most today, and what it really costs to say yes. Let me set the table first. After 3 years of falling prices, the market turned. Secondary prices rose 1.9% in the first quarter of 2026, the third straight quarter of gains above 1%, with 25 of the 35 tracked brands sitting in positive territory. The full year of 2025 closed up 4.9% against double-digit declines the 2 years before that. That is not a boom. That is a pulse. And underneath that pulse, the money is not spreading evenly. It is running hard at watches with a story, watches that are original, and watches that are genuinely scarce. Everything else just sits in the case and waits. And the people asking have changed. 10 years ago, the vintage buyer was a man in his 60s buying back the watch he wore in his 30s. Today, it is just as likely to be somebody in their 20s who has never owned a mechanical watch in their life, who found the reference number on a phone screen at midnight, and who walks in already knowing which dial variant they want. Auction results travel now. Steve McQueen's Monaco, Paul Newman's Daytona, a Seiko that went to space. Those results reach people who have never set foot in an auction room, and every one of those headlines sends somebody looking for the affordable version of the same story. That is the engine under this entire list. Coming in at number 7, the Seiko 6139. You know it as the Pogue. Yellow dial, red and blue tachymeter, one of the first automatic chronographs the world ever saw, and the first automatic chronograph worn in space. Colonel William Pogue bought his at a base exchange, carried it up on Skylab in 1973, and made a $200 Japanese sport watch into a legend. 15 years ago, you could buy one for 120 euros. People did. People threw them in drawers. Today, a clean, unpolished, all-original example runs from about 1,500 to 3,500 pounds, and it has become one of the most heavily counterfeited vintage watches on Earth. That is the whole vintage story in one watch. The moment a thing becomes wanted, somebody starts building fakes of it. Number 6 is the one that surprises people, and it is the Universal Genève Polar Router. Built in 1954 for Scandinavian Airlines and their first flights straight over the North Pole. Designed by a 23-year-old kid named Gerald Genta years before he drew the Royal Oak and the Nautilus. Twisted lugs, crosshair dial, micro-rotor movement. For 20 years, this was the watch every forum recommended to somebody with $1,000 in good taste. Then the brand came back. The ownership group behind Breitling bought Universal Genève, and in 2026, the Polar Router returned as a full collection starting around 14,000 Swiss francs. Watch what a relaunch does to the vintage market. New buyers discover the name, then go looking for the original, and the sleeper stops sleeping. At number 5, pre-Tag Heuer, Carrera, Autavia, Monaco. If you want to understand why these move, look at the numbers. Heuer built fewer than 10,000 Monacos across every dial variation in the entire production run. Fewer than 15,000 of the 1960s screwback Autavias in 7 years. Fewer than 20,000 of the 1960s Carreras. These were not mass-market watches. They were racing instruments that mostly got worn like racing instruments. Steve McQueen strapped a Monaco reference, 1133B on for Le Mans in 1970, and that single decision still carries a premium that no movement or case specification can explain. The Carrera collectors chase hardest is the 2447 with the silver dial and black registers, the one everybody calls the Panda. Ask around. There is always somebody looking. Number 4 is where I have to slow down, because this is the watch that created an entire category. The Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, reference 5402ST, 1972. Steel. Priced like gold. The industry thought Audemars Piguet had lost their minds. Genta drew it, the story goes, in a single night. Here is the part that gets me. The first 1,000 pieces, the A series, trade today around $90,000 to $100,000. The B and C series carry the same history for $50,000 to $60,000. The D series is accessible around $40,000. $40,000 for the foundational reference of a category that now generates billions of dollars a year. There are modern Royal Oaks with no history at all asking more. Now let me stop the countdown for a minute, because there is something you need to hear before you spend anything. The single biggest premium driver in this market is no longer the name on the dial. It is originality. Not just an untouched dial, but the whole ecosystem of the watch. The handset, the crown, the crystal, the case geometry, the color of the lume, the way the lugs still come to a point instead of a soft, rounded nub. A refinished dial cuts value roughly in half, and the major auction houses will not take a redialed watch at full estimate. A Frankenwatch, assembled out of parts from 3 different donors, loses 50 to 90% and is often unsellable to a serious collector. Every polish takes metal off the case forever, and you cannot put it back. Here is the hard part. On these vintage pieces, the polished, redialed, hacked together example and the honest, untouched one photograph almost identically on a phone screen. That gap between what a photo shows you and what a loupe shows you is where the money is lost. And the ground underneath all of this is moving too. Gold has climbed so fast that a lot of vintage gold watches now sit barely above their melt value. That does 2 things. It puts a floor under the good ones, and it quietly feeds the compromised ones into the crucible. The tired, over-polished, redialed examples are literally disappearing. The supply that survives gets cleaner every year, and it never comes back. And then there is the part nobody puts in the listing. Somebody has to service it. A vintage automatic chronograph with a vertical clutch that has sat in a drawer since the Clinton administration is not a watch. It is a project with a bracelet on it. Parts for the Swiss chronographs get found. Parts for the odd Japanese calibers get made or cannibalized, or you wait. Before you fall in love with a reference, find out who works on it and what they charge, because a $1,500 watch with a $900 service bill is a very different purchase than the one you thought you were making. One more thing worth knowing about what people want right now. They want smaller. For 15 years, the industry sold us bigger and bigger cases, and the market has swung hard the other way. Over the last 2 years, the 35mm Patek Nautilus 7118 has climbed 52% on the secondary market, while the 40mm 5711 rose 27%. That preference lands directly on vintage, because almost everything built before 1980 measures between 34 and 38mm. The proportions that felt dated a decade ago are the exact proportions people are hunting today. Which brings us to number 3, and I do not think anybody saw this coming 5 years ago. Cartier. The Tank, the Santos, the Panther. Those 3 models now account for roughly 70 to 80% of Cartier's secondary market transaction volume. One major dealer reports the average Cartier sale price climbing 36.5% in 3 years, from $4,800 in 2023 to $6,553 in 2026, with sales volume up 75% year over year. Part of that is a design that has not needed changing since Louis Cartier drew it in 1917. Part of it is that everyone from Warhol to Jackie Kennedy to Muhammad Ali wore one. And part of it, if we are being honest, is fashion. When a pop star wears a vintage Panther, the phone rings here the next week. Collectors hate admitting that. It is still true. Number 2, the Omega Speedmaster. Specifically, the 145.022 with the caliber 861. This is the Moon Era reference, produced from 1968 into the 90s, and it is the best entry point into space history that exists. Clean examples trade between about $4,000 and $15,000, and Omega still services them, which is not something you can say about most of what we handle. But this is also where the vintage market gets genuinely strange. The correct .over-90 bezel insert for these watches peaked around $5,000 on its own, for a piece of anodized aluminum. Reproduction inserts have been circulating long enough now that they have picked up real patina, and they fool people. Think about that. A part is worth more than the value it adds to the watch it belongs on. And the most requested vintage watch that walks through this door, number 1, is the Rolex Submariner 5513. Nearly 3 decades of production, 1962 to 1989, and it is still the watch people describe with their hands before they know the reference number. No date, no cyclops. Not even chronometer certified, and the purists love it more for that. Early gilt dial examples bring $20,000 to $35,000, and better ones go past $40,000. Matte dials from the 70s land somewhere around $10,000 to $25,000, depending entirely on how honest the case is. An unpolished 5,513 with its original dial, hands, and insert can be worth 2 or 3 times a restored one wearing the same reference number. Same watch on paper. Completely different object in your hand. There is no Patek Philippe on this list, and that is not an oversight. People ask about Patek. They just ask a different question. They ask whether they should, not whether we have one. So where does this actually leave you? The people who do this for a living do not agree, and I think that is the most useful thing I can tell you. Eric Wind of Wind Vintage sees a healthier market than the mania of 2021, with fewer bidders but deeper pockets, chasing genuine trophies. John Reardon of Collectability looks at the same numbers and says, "Buyer beware, we are approaching the point where logic might need to kick in." He worries that too many collectors are watching the return instead of the watch, and that historically, that is exactly what a top sounds like. They are both right. The trophy end is fragmenting away from everything else, and the boring middle is where the actual opportunity lives. Here is what I would tell you across the counter. Chase the story you actually love, not the story somebody told you would appreciate. Buy the honest example over the cheap one, every single time, because condition is the only thing in this hobby you cannot buy back later. Learn the reference. Learn what the correct hands look like. Learn what a soft lug looks like. Because 4 watches crossed $1 million in a room in New York this spring, and almost none of us will ever sit in that room. But the watch that gets asked for the most is still the one somebody's father wore to work every day for 20 years, and that one is still out there, in a drawer, waiting for the right person to ask. So